so much for coming out tonight. I want to start by providing a little bit of context as to why exactly I am here. So I've been a part of the autism community for the past 8 years, working as a caregiver, ally, and advocate. I am an allistic. This word comes from Greek and it means different or other. And it was coined by the autism community for people like me who are not autistic. And because of that, I want to make it very clear exactly why I'm standing for you today. First is because of the families and my wonderful autistic friends who have gifted me with their stories, knowledge, and lots of encouragement. They are why I'm standing here for you today. The second is because 8 years ago, my world was completely changed. And it was not until a friend of mine convinced me to travel with her family from Dallas down to Houston to serve 1 week at a family retreat that I had the opportunity to interact with someone on Autism Spectrum Disorder. This family retreat was put on by Johnny and friends, and the goal was to provide respite to families impacted by disability specifically. Now, I had grown up alongside individuals with disability. My best friend had 2 older siblings with developmental delay, so I was familiar with the community and I knew that I loved being around them. But the one diagnosis that truly intimidated me was autism. I distinctly remember telling my friend on the drive down to Houston that I would be fine working with any camper of any age with any diagnosis, but I could not handle a child with autism. It frightened me. And I learned that week that God has a sense of humor, because the next day I received my buddy assignment, and who did I get? An 11-year-old boy with autism. Little did I know this boy would be the catalyst that would change the trajectory of my entire life. The moment he and his mom drove onto campus, I quickly learned 2 things. 1, his name was Carson, with a K, not a C. And 2, he was so excited about the fact that we were going to be best friends for the week. He completely rocked my world. And he laid the groundwork for what would become my second catalyst for advocacy, a little boy named Wes. And this is who you see pictured on the screen above. I was in my second year of college and looking for an additional part-time job, and I got hired as an after-school nanny for a 10-year-old boy with autism. This is him pictured in the middle, and that was pictured in the slide before. Wes is not verbal in the typical sense. He uses songs and scripts primarily to communicate. He is truly one of the smartest and sassiest kids that I know. And his family honestly became a lifeline for me, especially during COVID. Work didn't stop for us. Wes's routine continued in spite of a pandemic. He may not have been in school, but he and his parents and I worked together to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a world that was pretty much totally falling apart. It was because of Wes that I became fully invested in advocacy. I went on after working with their family and completing college to become a full-time employee with Johnny and Friends, that volunteer organization that I mentioned earlier. And it was this opportunity that gave me the chance to interact with even more children impacted by autism. And they are all pictured above. I didn't have time to track down their parents and ask to show their faces, but they're beautiful souls with incredible personalities. So why did I spend all this time talking about Wes and Carson? Well, because even though there's so many wonderful things about life with Wes and with Carson, there were dark days too. Through my days working with Wes specifically, I saw how hard his mom had to work to get him access just to the basic things like therapy, education, doctor's appointments that would better support him and increase his quality of life. I experienced firsthand the blatant and judgmental stares whenever we would go out in public. I saw the struggle to find caregivers and the struggle to maintain those caregivers once they were found and hired, because often, as soon as they were hired, they would leave. It was largely through conversations with his mom and through other moms within the Johnny and Friends circle that I saw a new and even more disturbing trend emerging. They and their children were being ostracized by the very members of their own community designed to support them. They were already isolated, already exhausted, and these parents would reach out to online support groups with questions like, what can I change holistically to help my child stop with the meltdowns? Or, my child needs to gain more independence. Does anybody have a resource for ABA? This is applied behavioral analysis. It's a little bit of a controversial therapy from the autism world. And instead of helpful advice or encouragement, they were met with shame. They were bullied. Some moms even had CPS called on them. And why was this? Because they dared to treat autism like it was, like a medical condition. This is what allowed me to hone in on a very specific pattern that has been emerging specifically in the past 4 years or so, although I would argue that the groundwork was laid long before that radical identity politics is starting to take over autism. In recent years, standard reception for what life looks like on the spectrum has become skewed. There is an overwhelming push for acceptance over awareness. And this, I believe, if left unchecked, will prove to be detrimental for everything the autism community has fought to achieve. Now, I'm not in any way denying the importance of including, respecting, and loving autistic people, because they're an absolutely incredible gift to society. However, to paint autism as a desirable diagnosis is to do a grave injustice to everything that these autistic children and families have endured. And so my goal for our time today here is very simple. I want to help you understand what autism is, common misconceptions surrounding this diagnosis, and most importantly, equip you with tools to help change the narrative. Because at the end of the day, autism is not an identity. So, what exactly is it? The DSM-5 describes autism as persistent deficits in social communication or interaction, along with restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And I think the easiest way to understand what is a very complex diagnosis is to break it down into these 3 points: viewing autism as a spectrum, viewing it as a medical condition, and then viewing it as something that has many comorbidities. And what do I mean by comorbidities? So this is a term coined by the scientific community, by the disabled community, and it just means when something occurs alongside another diagnosis. So for example, children with Down syndrome often have heart defects. The Down syndrome is not caused by the heart defect, but the heart defect is caused by the Down syndrome. Therefore, it is considered a comorbidity. So that's what that word means, just so you can keep in mind. Autism as a spectrum has 3 levels. Level 1, individuals require minimal support. They may struggle in social situations, but they're generally able to function independently with the appropriate supports and routines in place. Level 2 often requires moderate support, so they may have more significant challenges in social communication. They may struggle with repetitive behaviors, and they often have very restricted interests or hyperfixations. Level 3 is also known as profound autism, and these are the individuals that require 24/7 support. We're often going to see behaviors that are more hyper and hypoactive. They're often unable to verbalize needs, and often prone to violent behaviors towards themselves or towards others, specifically during meltdowns. I want to focus on profound autism because, contrary to popular belief, a actually large chunk of the autistic community is made up of individuals with profound autism. Current numbers estimate a little over 40%. And these are the voices that we are not hearing. These are the voices that are bullied into silence. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen a violent meltdown or experienced that firsthand, but I have. I have been scratched, bitten, cussed out. I have had my hair pulled, my jewelry broken, furniture thrown at me. And sometimes children will direct that aggression towards themselves. They may try to bite their own fingers off, scratch their eyes out, or headbang on the floor. And the caregiver responsible for them at that time is left with nothing else to do but try to hold them in place and pray that their strength lasts longer than the meltdown. The hardest part about these episodes is watching the child or adult that you love emerge from them. A meltdown is much different than a tantrum. It is when their brain and their body go into complete and utter survival mode, and they oftentimes have no control over what is happening to them in that particular circumstance. Similar to a veteran who's experiencing a PTSD episode, these children, for whatever reason, whether that be overstimulation, understimulation, a change in routine, their brains are thrown into this state of survival, and their bodies are left floundering trying to fight against an enemy that they just can't identify. So you watch them process what happened as they kind of melt down. Happened to them and to the people around them because their brain hijacked their body. And there is such limited support for families impacted by profound autism. I once spoke with a mom in Texas who literally had to lock herself in her bathroom to protect herself from her adult son during a violent meltdown. And when she tried to share her story to get help for her son to figure out how she could ease this suffering, she was shamed for, and I quote, demonizing her son's autism and exploiting the story for attention. Another interview I conducted with a mom named Nicole, based out of Florida, excellently summarized the experiences that these families impacted by level 3 autism have. She said simply, I just want to end the stigma that I'm a bad parent for wanting better things for my child. Autism is not a superpower, it's a super need for support. And to call it a superpower is just absolute gaslighting. She then went on to tell me a story of how she had CPS called on her because she made a post online about how she was able to help her son decrease the instances of violent meltdowns through detox and nutritional support. And autism moms, they're the best researchers in the world. So of course, she went on and she researched the trolls. She figured out exactly who was posting these derogatory things, who called CPS, who was saying she was an uncaring mother for trying to help her son. And she found that the majority of people trolling online were self-diagnosed autistic advocates. According to Nicole, this happens all the time to so many families. They are being threatened into silence. So we now understand autism as a spectrum. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about what life looks like with profound autism. So now let's look at it as a medical condition. So autism as a medical condition actually physically impacts the structure of the brain. And this surprisingly is not well-known information, but we do have scans and studies coming out now that it states it is objectively true that the brains of children with autism look different than the brains of people without. Specifically, you're going to see different neuron connections within the frontal lobe. And so that's what's exemplified right here. Neurotypical brain is going to be in the center. You can see that the flow of neurons is pretty consistent, is well organized. In a hypoconnective autistic brain, there's breaks in neurons. There's simply not enough. Where the hyperconnectivity is going to contribute to that only activity often present in autism. And that is where there's so much information and so many neuron connections, but the brain just doesn't understand how to process it. In the temporal lobe, there's disconnect between the tongue and the brain, and this affects communication. Oftentimes in autistic children, the brainstem is underdeveloped, and that is partially what contributes to aggression. Within the amygdala and hippocampus, and even the basal ganglia, you see structural abnormalities, and this results in difficulty in memory, learning, emotional regulation, and a fixation on repetitive behavior. Communication is another big aspect of dealing with autism. Close to 40% of individuals with ASD are nonverbal, and this means they don't use speech as a primary method of communication. So they might mean to say they're cold, but what comes out of their mouth is car. Or they use scripts to communicate, whether that be from a favorite TV series or a favorite song. They'll try to contextualize a lyric or quote to communicate what they actually need to say. This frustration is also often linked to behavior issues, because can you imagine being trapped in your own brain, unable to get the words inside your head out into the public? Maybe you're a typically functioning 14-year-old boy who happens to have nonverbal autism. You're intelligent, you have thoughts, you have opinions, but you can't get your brain to communicate with your tongue. It also impacts fine and complex motor skills. This causes issues in things like writing, feeding yourself, toileting yourself, dressing yourself, all of the above. This is why a lot of children who have autism have to invest a lot of time in PT and OT. And finally, it affects physical tone and muscle development. So this is where we're going to see hyper or hypotonia. If you've ever seen a child toe walking, it usually has to do with the fact that the tone is developed a certain way that's not conducive to walk flat-footed. And as you can imagine, this causes a whole slew of issues walking on your tiptoes all the time. And finally, there are many comorbidities associated with autism. Before I lock this list here, because it's a long one, here we go. The comorbidities of autism, they're estimated to be around 80, but that is just a guesstimated number. I'm not going to go through all 80, but we're going to hit on a couple of the top, I want to say there's 12 here. So first is anxiety. I believe everybody knows what that is to an extent. Depression, also pretty common knowledge. Sleep disorders. So when it comes to autism, oftentimes these kids have problems sleeping. And once they do fall asleep, they don't stay asleep for long. So imagine having a newborn baby for 25 years straight. ARFID is a little bit of a newer diagnosis that has been correlated with autism. And this is where you have extreme sensory aversion to certain textures or smell of food to the point where you would rather starve yourself than eat at all. HxA is the opposite of ARFID. This is where children or adults may display the habits of eating non-food items, such as rock, sand, cleaner, etc. Failure to thrive because of eating disorders like ARFID and HxA. Self-interest behaviors, which is often limited to meltdowns, but not exclusive. Some children have more OCD-like tendencies, and so this leads to self-injury. Tourette syndrome is common in children with autism. ODD, immune function disorders, metabolic disorders, celiac disease and diseases of digestion, epilepsy, gastrointestinal disorders, OCD, and many, many more. So now I feel you have a fairly decent grasp on what exactly autism is, its medical condition, comorbidities, and as a spectrum. So let's take some time to talk about the data. The data on diagnostic prevalence. So the term autism spectrum was born in the 1990s. It's officially added to the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And at that point in time, the rates were 1 in 500 children. By 2013, it became 1 in 63. By 2018, you were looking at 1 in 36. And this year, 2025, the occurrence is 1 in 31. And I want to make one thing very clear, that as the rates of autism have increased, so have the rates of level 3 autism. Okay, so that 40% has been consistent throughout. It is estimated that 1 in 2 children will be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder by the year 2030. And this specifically is why it is imperative that I believe people be made aware of the fact that this is not a social contagion, and this is not something that can be brushed away as mere-edited politics. This is a major issue. It is going to impact future generations. We're looking at caregiver burnout, children without therapies, parents who are passing away, and children being left to the care of the state. We're going to have a hard time filling blue-collar jobs, teachers, government officials, nurses. This is why it is so important to stop the attitudes from shifting in the wrong direction. Society says to accept this as an identity, and that is objectively untrue. So why are we pretending that this increase is a good thing? Why are we choosing to make research on root causes and potential treatment a political and moral issue? Autism itself might not need a cure, but the children and adults suffering from the negative symptoms caused by autism deserve one. And I do want to point one more thing out, because this is often an argument presented to me, that the reason we see a diagnostic increase is because screening is getting better. And while I wish that were true, unfortunately it is not. If screening was getting better, where are the level 3 autistics in their 50s to 60s and 70s? These simply don't exist. It's not that it's easier to screen for autism, it's that it literally is a space course. So let's take a look at autism as pertains to identity politics. A recent study out of Cambridge reports that neurodiversity has achieved the most traction in relation to autism. However, friction within identity politics over definitions of who is included in this particular group create further confusion. The neurodiversity movement has been accused of being unrepresentative of all people, and specifically unrepresentative of the more impaired people on the autism spectrum. So this is a criticism not just made by clinicians and researchers at Cambridge, but by autistic people and their parents. And this shift of voices from those heavily impacted to those who are mildly impacted is what I believe is imperative to focus on. Awareness campaigns do perpetuate medicalized attitudes, and we need this because we need to understand how to increase the quality of life, and we need to understand why the prevalence of autism is growing. The self-acceptance versus awareness is two of the most important things that I believe we can break down to best understand this. I received an article from a professor here, and he basically sends it over saying, take a look at this and tell me what you think about the verbiage acceptance versus awareness. And objectively, looking at these two terms, I didn't initially see anything wrong with it. The definition of acceptance is the action or process that being received as adequate or suitable, typically to be admitted into a group, whereas awareness is the quality or state of being aware. Knowledge and understanding that something happens or exists. And the specific quote that I was asked to read over states that Autism Acceptance Month is a time to intentionally include, faithfully affirm, and openly embrace autistic people. Now, intentional inclusion is imperative, and faithful affirmation is identity-based language. It implies that an individual requires external affirmation for something that they are dealing with, like a diagnosis. This language is weird because we really don't ask society to affirm something like Down syndrome or diabetes. So why is there a push for affirmation surrounding autism? The quote continues. While the Biden administration formally recognized Autism Acceptance Month, President Trump has proclaimed it Autism Awareness Month, reverting to the outdated and harmful terminology, which emphasizes alertness to a threat rather than welcoming differences. This language is both divisive and objectively untrue. First of all, it makes a non-political issue political. Neither Trump nor Biden are self-professing autism experts, and I don't believe that either should have the power to dictate the standard of public perception surrounding this diagnosis. It's up to us, the people, the advocates, and most importantly, the autistic community itself. Awareness does not in and of itself emphasize a threat. It simply means to be knowledgeable and understanding of a situation that's happening. And I feel that this is a good time to talk about the announcement that took place earlier this week. I prepared these notes and this PowerPoint prior to the administration releasing the information that Tylenol is linked to an increase in autism. And I wasn't originally going to say anything, but I feel that it provides a very good example of how politicized autism has become. The SDA released a series of studies from organizations like Mount Sinai and highly acclaimed research institutions linking Tylenol to the increase in autism. And believe it or not, this information is actually not new. The autism community has known about this connection since the early 2000s, but nobody wanted to listen until now. And instead of being hailed as heroes, the FDA, for finally releasing this information, for moms being excited that they have an opportunity to potentially avoid increasing the rate of autism in their children, it's become political. There's videos all over social media of pregnant mothers literally downing Tylenol models just to spite the current administration. The narrative is being twisted and it's being stated that this particular administration is demonizing autism, that they are making up lies about Tylenol, that Tylenol was invented after autism came to be, so how could it possibly be interconnected? And they're completely writing off the fact that this link is based on science, not on politics. And honestly, this particular discourse and discussion is more frustrating than anything because it makes me to be, if we spent the time and energy that these people are spending debating Tylenol on actually helping these families, we would be in a much better place. Another problem that's worth addressing is the self-diagnosis problem. And this specifically encourages individuals to take what they know about their current situation and apply it to what they think to be a diagnosis. And a quote that I thought summed this up well coming out of Cambridge is that self-diagnosis alters the social standing and definition of a diagnosis. The most serious consequence of taking a diagnosis out of the hands of psychiatrists is that it almost inevitably shifts focus toward the milder end of the spectrum. And I've lost my face in notes. On, please. There you go. This is a quote from Anthony, but not what I was looking for. I wanted to be sure I said his name. We are seeing very aggressive voices on one end of the spectrum, drowning out the voices on the opposite end of the spectrum. So what this means is the high-functioning autistics who have diagnosed themselves with autism are absolutely overwhelming the voices of parents and autistic individuals impacted by level 2 and level 3 autism. I personally don't know a single person on the autism spectrum who wants this diagnosis to be everything about who they are as a person, except for those who have claimed it as a self-diagnosis. And when I asked my friend Sophie to summarize exactly what her experience was as being a high-functioning autistic adult, she said, and I quote, "My identity is so much more than my diagnosis." Furthermore, and this is very important, experience from a specialist clinic showed that only around half of referrals of people with a high index suspicion that they had autism spectrum disorder met operational diagnostic criteria. And the important point is that the remainder had alternative and treatable conditions. So to break it down a little further, let's look at it this way. You have a group of 100 adults who believe they're on the autism spectrum. And of that 100, only 50 actually are. There you go. And in summary, we're not all a little autistic. So of this 50% that feels they might have autism but actually doesn't, are dealing with what are very common psychiatric and or nutritional deficiency disorders. The most common is going to be PTSD or PTS. So PTSD is what's going to contribute to things like sensory sensitivities, self-soothing or semming behaviors, difficulty with executive function, difficulty with emotional dysregulation, stimuli avoidance, and struggling in social situations. Anxiety can actually cause all of the above, as well as selective mutism and communication issues. Technology addictions are real, and sometimes they manifest as autism-like behaviors. Lead poisoning is a common one, especially for people who live in older neighborhoods where they might have dirty pipes. Attachment disorders from childhood trauma, hyperlexia, and even narrow interests. Hyperfixations are actually pretty normal. They're not always an indicator of autism. I asked my friend, Sophie, who I mentioned earlier, who is an advocate based out of London for the autism community. She actually fights against trans ideology as it pertains to autistic girls, and that's a can of worms I hot opened today, but I highly encourage you to look her up if you're interested in learning more. And I asked her to summarize briefly why the current attitudes surrounding autism in politics are problematic. And she said she's honestly resistant to joining advocacy because everything is so political. Ultimately, we need to stop seeing autism as an identity. We shouldn't cleave to autism, because if we cleave to it, you can't get help for it. She said, "My autism is a huge challenge, but I learned how to harness it. People get fixated on emotions, and I can help think things through by logic. I don't need people to celebrate my autism." The problem is that the advocacy that exists right now promotes a victim mentality. Everyone has a unique brain. We just don't all have a label. So how can you make a difference? What can you actively do to change the narrative surrounding autism and identity politics? To answer this question is why I am standing before you today. The self-identifying victim mentality is hurting the autism communities across all levels of the spectrum. It is invalidating voices of high-functioning autistic individuals, and it is pushing the lower-functioning autistic individuals deeper into isolation and silence. It is causing autism to be seen by those on the outside as just another identity card. And this is wrong. So how can you make a difference? What can you do to change the narrative? My first recommendation would always be to educate yourself. And in the spirit of education, I want to quickly talk about DEI. This was also addressed in the Cornell Daily Sun article that was sent to me as something that should actually be encouraged and promoted. And the way that the article explained it was that you should invest in DEI at your jobs and universities because these are the people that are going to help push forward inclusion for autistic individuals. And this is wrong. Objectively, disability has never been a significant issue for DEI. DEI exclusively focuses on diversity as it pertains to race and sexuality. Disability was never part of the conversation. Both right and left-wing advocates seem to agree that most corporations view disability as a completely separate issue from DEI. And for the past 4 years especially, the disabled community has been left out of DEI conversations. And this has been a pretty big frustration point from people all across the board. Additionally, disability inclusion really needs to be part of a company's organizational strategy in order to be successful. It's not going to be enough for inclusion to be presented as a special project through mandatory DEI training or hiring bias. I'm not denying there's a significant need for disability inclusion in the workplace, but to pinpoint DEI as the answer, we're barking up the wrong tree. It's actually the ADA, not the DEI, that is responsible for diversity within schools and the workplace. It says specifically, employers cannot discriminate against qualified individuals with disabilities and must provide reasonable accommodations to allow them to perform essential job functions. And this is an actual law, right? Not just the social effort. They also go on to specifically state that Title I requires employers with 15 or more employees to provide qualified individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from the full range of employment-related opportunities available to others. And so the ADA is what's responsible for diversity in the workplace. It's the ADA that's responsible for diversity within schools. And finally, it is not DEI, but actually the HxA that is responsible for the enforcement of these laws. People often get this bill used, which I highlight just for your reference. So that ultimately, at the end of the day, you can be helpful at DEI, not so much. So how can you actually make a difference? Well, you made the first step by coming here tonight. Educating yourself and learning more about the experiences of this community is an excellent place to start. You're doing the right thing just by listening to presentations like this one. And I hope that you have learned something, but if not, I highly encourage you to go forward and do your own research. Have conversations. Read books written by parents or by children impacted by autism. Talk to people. Talking is one of the best ways that we can problem solve and learn to build a more accepting world. And listen to what autism communities have to say. And direct to these conversations from the mindset of humble learning and not from trying to defend your point or trying to convince them of a particular stance. Talk about autism openly, and when I say that, I mean we need to give level 3 families a seat at the table. This means we have to support and listen to the parents who are fighting so hard to increase the quality of life for their children. A very common theme that we see, especially within the level 2 and level 3 families, is that these parents are dismissed and their experiences are ignored because they're speaking on behalf of their child. People will say, "Who are you to talk about the experience of life living with autism? You're not autistic. How would you know?" And this particular stance is so sad to me because for a lot of these kids, the voices of their parents are the only voices that they have. It is important for us to listen because autism can't be a superpower until every single autistic person has the support and the resources that they need. And you can help these children and adults reach their full potential simply by being willing to listen and learn. Autism is not a symptom of a failing world, but using autism for social, political, or personal gain is. Another way that you can help is by learning your willful laws. So what a lot of people don't know about the disability community is that most states and counties allocate a certain amount of funds to provide caregivers and therapies for children and adults who are disabled. The problem is this fluctuates state by state, county by county. So a practical example is this. I worked as a caregiver for an adult in Dallas for 3 years, and she was older. She had been in the system for a very long time. And at the time that I worked for her, she was able to pay her caregivers around $15 an hour. And this is almost unheard of in the state of Texas. The average caregiver makes between $10 and $12 an hour. We don't get benefits. We don't get insurance. We don't get a retirement fund. We don't get vacation leave. And that is simply not enough to live off of. And furthermore, the type of people that are attracted to these jobs often are simply unable to stay. So you may be able to work in a $12 an hour job for 3 to 6 months, but soon you have to move on to find something that pays you more, that has more benefits. And so these families are caught in a constant turning wheel of caregivers coming in and coming out, which is hard enough for a disability that's physical, but for a child with autism who relies on routine and structure and dependability, this can be detrimental. On the contrary, in Pennsylvania, I also worked as a caregiver, and there I made $25 an hour. I had insurance, I had retirement, I had paid medical leave. And it was the exact same government entity that employed me both in Texas and in Pennsylvania, but the difference was the legislation. The difference was the way that people were voting. And this is a tangible impact that you can make by educating yourself on the laws within your own specific state. If you're not able to work as a caregiver, you can at least be knowledgeable to vote in legislation that makes it easier for these families to hire qualified individuals. And finally, it's really important to be objective and not defensive. Objectivity is going to be your greatest asset. Entering into these types of conversations with an attitude of a listener and not a debater is going to take you a very, very long way. Don't assume that parents of children with autism are not worthy voices. Like I mentioned before, for many nonverbal children, they're the only voices that they have. It's very important also to stop pushing identity-centered language. Autism is a monotone vision. It does need a diagnosis. You don't get to choose to be autistic in the same way that you don't get to put on a Dexcom and choose to be diabetic. It's not a costume. Enter into these conversations with this community with humility. Listen to learn. Don't listen to defend or respond. Objectively, a world without autism would be a very dark place. This community is filled with some of the kindest, wisest, funniest, and most unconditionally loving people I know. But they need your support. They need people like you to be willing to take a stance for their voices. I hope you walk away tonight, a little bit of a shorter lecture than planned, with a desire to do more than politicize or merely accept autism. I hope you leave with tools or at least inspiration to become a better ally and advocate for what is arguably the most incredible population in the world. Thank each of you for coming tonight. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for listening, and thank you for caring.